Yeah. Okay, everybody, I think we're ready to begin this evening. It's a pleasure to welcome Hilde Heynen to the AA this evening for the first of a series of lectures for her course this term called City Architecture and Gender. And before saying something about Hilde, let me just mention this is the second component of an open lecture series in the graduate school this term, which began last week with Javier Costa's first lecture and will continue to the end of term. The series is open to all graduate students in all of the programs who are invited to participate, attend the lectures, and to make submissions for the formal coursework in each of the programs. This series that Hilde begins this evening will alternate. She will be here every 2 weeks this term for a total of 4 trips. And while everyone's got their pencils out, after tonight's lecture, Hilde will be back on the 30th of October, and then 2 weeks after that on the 13th of November, and then the 27th of November, for a total of 4 talks. During each of the visits, Hilde will do a lecture in the evenings on Monday here, and after this lecture tonight, the others will be at 5 o'clock in this room, and each will be followed by a seminar on Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock in this room, open to all the graduate students who would like to participate in the course formally and make a submission and follow up the issues that are raised in each of the lectures. Hilde's course series of lectures, she's titled City Architecture and Gender. We'll be looking kind of systematically at the topic of the city and its relationship to architecture, really through the concept of gender. She will be exploring the history of 20th century definitions of everyday space, and look at the rise, really, of concepts of gender with concepts of the modern city in the 20th century. Hilde joins us from Belgium, where she'll be traveling for each of the visits, where she is on the Department of Architecture at Katholieke Universiteit Leuven in Belgium. Most recently, Hilde has published a book titled Architecture and Modernity by MIT Press in 1999, which in 4 chapters went through really the rise of modern architecture, I think in a way alongside really the rise and development of critical theory itself, and the kind of oscillating interplay between modern architecture and how architects write about modernity and cultural modernity, as Hilde describes it at the beginning of the book. The book goes through 1920s to 1990s in its development. In architecture, really, the theories of Gideon forward to Koolhaas in a project at the end of the 80s, and its reception in the 1990s, by way of really several sub-chapters, really illuminating chapters on critical theory and description of space, by writers like Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, Tafuri in mid-century, and Derrida later in the 20th century. I think it's a period that roughly corresponds to the period of work that Hilde will be discussing in the 4 lectures of this term. And it's a pleasure to welcome Hilde Heynen.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me over here. It's really a pleasure for me to be present at the school and to be part of your undertakings. I hope that well, something will come of it, and that my contribution here will not be just, let's say, this thing giving lectures, but that also the seminars, which will start from tomorrow onwards, will provoke you to think about some of the topics I will raise and to do some work on these. Well, gender, of course, is a very fashionable topic, and I think it's right that it is so, because there has been done some very interesting work in this field of research. My personal evolution, maybe I should explain this to you, why I came to be interested in the topics of gender. You can say that, well, there has been a kind of shift for me from what I did first, studying the relationship between architecture and modernity from the point of view of critical theory, which resulted in this book that Brett Steele was describing. Whereas now I am studying, I would say, the very same relationship between architecture and modernity, but rather from the point of view of feminist theories and gender studies. And in a way, this is a very logical evolution, at least to me, because you could say that critical theory is focusing on social and political factors which generate exclusion on the basis of class. Whereas feminism, of course, studies social, cultural, political factors which generate also exclusion, but this time on the basis of gender. You could say that one thing, of course, is missing in when I tell it you like this. One thing is missing. There is a third aspect, ethnicity or race, clearly being studied in colonialism, post-colonialism, Orientalism, and so on. This, of course, is not my main field of study right now, but I think there is some alignment with feminist thought, and there are some convolutions between these two trends of thoughts. I will mention one of them. There has been, for me, exciting developments in the field of research relating feminist thought with architecture and the city. Maybe it's useful to differentiate between three basic strategies which have chronologically come one after the other, but are still very much operational, all three of them. The first one is, the oldest one I would say, is feminism which really stressed the issue of equality, that men and women are equal. This feminism, of course, demanded equal treatment, equal opportunities, and so on. It's based upon the idea, or it defends the idea, that men and women are essentially the same, and that a gender difference should not produce hierarchical distinctions. After this first feminism came a second one, or a second wave, let's say, which rather stressed the idea of difference. Men and women, it's conceived in this strategy, are essentially different. What is wrong with the present situation is that men's values are dominant at the expense of women's qualities and values. What should be attacked, according to this trend of thought, what should be attacked is the implicit hierarchy which consistently prefers the masculine above the feminine. Women should not struggle to become the same as men, and that was a little bit what the first wave of feminism was after. Women should not struggle to become the same as men. They rather should develop their own feminine qualities and sensibilities, thus opening up the richness of matriarchal heritages. That's the second trend of thought, which has clearly the danger of a kind of essentialist thinking in it. And the third wave, the most recent wave, tries to correct this danger of essentialism. It's called by some constructionism, and to my mind it's clear that it has that it is akin to deconstructivist thought. Constructionism as deconstructivist thought stress the idea that gender differentiations are not natural givens, but rather socio-historical constructions. This means that our ideas of how men are or should be, and how women are or should be, that these are constructions and that one can trace the genealogy of these constructions. So it's especially this last trend of thought that has generated these very interesting developments in theory. There is a wide range of recent publications available in this field, and I hope some of you will explore these publications together with me. I just refer to three of them: the edited volumes Desiring Practices, The Sex of Architecture, and Architecture and Feminism. In a way, Mark Wigley set up the program for this last trend, this constructionist trend, a possible program of gender studies in architecture. I quote him, what he is saying, and this statement is, I would say, the basic conviction of everyone working in this field. I quote Wigley. The active production of gender distinctions can be found at every level of architectural discourse, in its rituals of legitimation, in its hiring practices, in its classification systems, in its lecture techniques, in its publicity images, its canon formation, its division of labor, its bibliographies, its design conventions, its legal codes, its salary structures, its publishing practices, its language, its professional ethics, its editing protocols, its project credits, and so on. In each side, the complicity of the discourse with both the general cultural subordination of the feminine and the specific subordination of particular women can be identified, often explicitly, but usually by way of covert social mechanisms that sustain bias at odds with overt formulations. End of quote. So this really, the active production of gender distinctions at all these levels, studying these, trying to unravel how these mechanisms work, where they are at work, that indeed is what gender studies in architecture set out to do. So what my contribution is here at the AA, or at least what I set out to do in these 4 lectures, is really today only offering you kind of introduction by reading together several of most recent work in this field which focus on the city, which focus on the topic of gender images related to the city. But it's really kind of overall introduction trying to set a tune. Next time I would focus on one such image, one gendered image of the city, by discussing the book by Sybil Moholy-Nagy, Matrix of Man, which is her history of urban settlements. The third lecture, I would address the topic of the places of the everyday and try to untangle how architectural discourse deals with the differentiation between high and low culture and how this might possibly be related to gender issues. In my last lecture, I hope, it's not yet written, I hope to be able to show you how gender images are also operative in the architect's self-representations and in the projects they make. So for today, it's about gendered images of the city. I will discuss 5 instances, 5 appearances of gendered images. First one will be city versus nature. Second, the public versus the private. Third, center versus suburb. Fourth, the city as labyrinth, as a female body that is. And 5, planning as disciplining the city's body. So it's really exploring how the city is conceived of in terms of gender. I'd like to have the slides, please. First appearance, first instance is the city versus nature. You have here a picture of Savannah, early planning of Savannah, the early layout of Savannah in the United States. And you see this very traditional image where the city is being depicted as the space of human civilization. Human civilization being, as it were, carved out of nature. This image of the city as being the conquest of nature, as being the establishment of culture and civilization which tame nature is not just an old one. I quote here, can be the motto for this first part, Le Corbusier saying, "A city, it is the grip of man upon nature, the grip of man upon nature." The city is man-made, like you see, man walking around in that cartoon. Man-made, some feminists also think that really the city is the man-made environment, that women are not really, do not really have part in making this city. A space which man, as I said, was able to conquer from nature, to get under control, to dominate. In this sense, the dichotomy between city and untamed territory, city and nature, is part of the structuring dichotomies, the binary logic, which is very, very influential in our Western tradition. These have been documented, but still I list them for you. The binary logic of Western thought opposes the rational versus the irrational, the order versus chaos, intelligence versus emotion, culture versus nature, city versus untamed territory, male versus female, mind versus body, dominating versus nurturing, high versus low, production versus consumption, public versus private, active versus passive, subject versus object, and you can go on. So there is a kind of these pairs of opposites structure our way of thinking. And within this overall structure, it's clear that the city occupies the same pole as do the male, the idea of the male, the idea of order, the idea of rationality, the idea of culture, versus the female, the body, nature, the irrational, and so on. So this kind of dichotomies, this kind of opposition between city and nature can indeed be traced back into the history of Western civilization quite far. Barbara Hooper gives a list of that. She refers to, for example, the Greek myth of Pandora, the first woman who really was the embodiment of disorder. She refers to Eve, Eve's transgression in the garden. I don't need to remind you of this myth, of course. She talks about Aristotle with his polis, Plato with the Republic, and so on, Descartes with his philosophy of res cogitans versus res extensa, and so on, up till Freud, who opposes male civilization and its female discontents. So all these famous writers and these myths, to begin with, oppose nature and culture, and it's clear that they gender both. Nature is gendered female, culture is gendered male. So you have a kind of eternal struggle, some would call it, which puts the order of male mind against the disorder of female body. I'd like to remind you in this respect that indeed these ideas of culture as being as the attempt or the power to tame nature, to domesticate nature, that this is indeed also a conception that you can also hear in the history of the word itself. Culture comes from the Latin colere, which means working the earth. processing, taking care of, but also dominating. So in fact, culture and colony come from the same basic word, colore, which has all these meanings. And for us, it's clear that colonization and neocolonialism and all these kind of things, we hear in these words, we hear that aspect of dominating and taking control. We usually do not hear it if somebody uses the word culture, but both go back to the same basis. So, of course, 20th century philosophy has, you can see it as a kind of criticism of this tradition of binary thinking, binary logic, of this tradition of thinking in opposing pairs. That is what Derrida is doing, of course, but it's also what important feminist thinkers and philosophers are doing. I just want to mention here Kristeva, Irigaray, and Braidotti. But this is not the end of the story. It might be a starting point, city being depicted as the man-made environment and being opposed to this image of untamed nature. But there are all other aspects going along with it. So this certainly is not the only gendered image that is important in talking about the city. A second appearance of gendered images is the public versus the private. This is also very old, of course, already. I'm giving you here a few quotations because maybe these quotations are the best way to introduce to you this line of thinking which has been so influential, so dominant in our tradition. For example, a quote from Alberti, quoted by Wigley, who is using this illustration, going with this quote. Alberti, 15th century. I agree, for you are indeed precisely of the opinion of the ancients. They used to say that men are by nature of a more elevated mind than women. The character of man is stronger than that of women and can bear the attacks of enemies better, can stand strain longer, is more constant under stress. Therefore, men have the freedom to travel with honor in foreign lands. Women, on the other hand, are almost all timid by nature, soft, slow, and therefore more useful when they sit still and watch over things. It is as though nature has thus provided for our well-being, arranging for men to bring things home and for women to guard them. The woman, as she remains locked up at home, should watch over things by staying at her post, by diligent care and watchfulness. The man should guard the woman, the house, and his family and country, but not by sitting still. End of quote. Alberti is here referring to the ancients because indeed he is taking up notions already mentioned by Xenophon in the 5th century before Christ. So it's really very old notions about what is the nature of man, what is the nature of women. And Wigley is exploring, in this article, The Housing of Gender, is exploring how these ideas indeed are very constitutive for architectural thinking, how they, in Alberti's case, and Alberti is kind of fundamental text for the discourse on architecture, how they, in Alberti's case, are structuring the discourse of architecture. So Alberti was already convinced that women should stay locked up at home and should dare watch over things. A couple of centuries later, 19th century, you have the very same idea or very similar idea. For example, with Ruskin, again I quote, "Man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. But woman's power is for rule, not for battle. And her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement, and decision. The man, in his rough work in open world, must encounter all peril and trial. But he guards the woman from all this. Within his house, as ruled by her, need enter no danger, no temptation, no cause of error or offense. This is the true nature of home. It is the place of peace." Like you see there, the place of peace. Ruled by woman, but she cannot leave the house, so to say. Indeed, the 19th century, as you all know, very much established this ideology of the separate spheres in which men and women both were supposed to be completely different beings, to have completely different needs, and to be at home or to be at ease in completely different spaces. This resulted in the 19th century in the fact that public space, the space of the city, the space of squares and streets, that this public space indeed was not easily accessible for women, that it was not in the same way accessible for women as it was for men. For example, I quote again a study by Jules Michelet on women, who tells us about the frustrations of women trying to go out on their own. I quote, "How many irritations for the single woman. She can hardly ever go out in the evening. She would be taken for a prostitute. There are 1,000 places where only men are to be seen, and if she needs to go there on business, the men are amazed and laugh like fools. For example, should she find herself delayed at the other end of Paris, this is London, but in many ways similar, should she find herself delayed at the other end of Paris and hungry, she will not dare to enter into a restaurant. She would constitute an event. She would be a spectacle. All eyes would be constantly fixed on her, and she would overhear uncomplimentary and bold conjectures." End of quote. Of course, this was a very bourgeois ideology, and it's obvious that not the same rules applied to all women. Working class women were had to obey different rules, different codes than bourgeois women. But the ruling idea was, if a woman is alone on the street, she cannot be a woman of virtue. She probably is a prostitute of something very similar to it. So these associations, as you know, have been very, very powerful in the 19th century. But whereas, woman and the home, that belonged to the previous one. These ideas have been very powerful in the 19th century in this way that also women who are present in the public sphere, like this is a painting from Palais Royal, a space of modernity, the very first arcade in Paris, that the women who were there were indeed prostitutes. I would say that these ideas still continue to be of consequence, not in their very rigid form, of course. I dare say that we as women can go out on the street without being taken for prostitutes, but still, this association of women with house and home is still very much active. And also you still have, again in the language, a notion like public woman, meaning, I think in English like in Dutch, a prostitute, this idea of what a public woman is, there is no symmetrical construction for a public man. A public man is not, as far as I know, a male prostitute, and this is because connecting public and man is a rather obvious thing to do. A man is still supposed to be a public figure. So you still have this asymmetrical accessibility of public space for women. Of course, women were absent in the arcades, or at least the bourgeois women of virtue were absent in the arcades. There is this whole literature about the invisible flaneuse, in the sense that the flaneur was kind of the key figure to describe the experience of modernity for authors like Walter Benjamin or Marshall Berman. Well, many feminists have indicated that in this literature on modernity, the flaneuse is lacking. The symmetrical figure is lacking. And this has also to do with the construction of the gaze. Also on this topic, a huge amount of literature is available. The gaze. The gaze is constructed as being the gaze of the male subject looking at a female object. This is already visible in this Renaissance drawing by Albrecht Dürer. It continues to be visible in things like this by Bosse on the perspective. It's no coincidence, I would say, that it's male figures who are here presented as being the bearers of the perspectival gaze. Also in art history, this has been, of course, abundantly analyzed, that the gaze in the history of the arts has been dominantly a male gaze looking at female models, and that this is also what this quote was about. Michelet telling us about the experience of women in public space. Women are in public space, at least in the 19th century, and to a very large amount still today also, are the object of the gaze. Men can go around rather inconspicuously, women cannot. Women are being looked at. I would like to refer to a very interesting case study in this respect by Susana Torre. Susana Torre discussing the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. These are not these mothers, this is something different. She claims that women, as I just also said, that women have often been seen as passive agents rather than active subjects. This is due, as I said, to the mechanism of the gaze. But she refers to instances where in history, indeed, women appeared in public space, like for example, women doing laundry at public washing basins. This kind of public space, this kind of activities by women has existed. Of course it has existed, but what you see happening is that these kind of activities are not heavily documented, that these kind of spaces are not, in general, not judged worthy of monumentalization and of remembering, so that these spaces are very often wiped out, that the traces that women left in public space are not valued in the sense of that they are worth being kept. So there are all kinds of mechanisms going on. Anyhow, her starting point, Susana Torres' starting point, is that she does not want to study women as passive objects, but rather as active agents, and that she wants to analyze how there can be a transformative presence in the city. And that is exactly for her what this case study of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina are all about. Nevertheless, these women have had a major influence on the happenings in Argentina. You know the story probably, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. They come together there. They have done this throughout several years. They are the mothers or the wives or the sisters of people who disappeared as victims of the military regime in Argentina. And they came to silently demonstrate, well, not really demonstrate. They showed up in public space at the Plaza de Mayo, the major square in Buenos Aires, to plea, to demand to know more about their disappeared children and husbands. Torres' argument is that they were a transformative power, but it's also like this, that they were a transformative power because exactly they knew how to play with the conventions about public space in several senses. For example, they, being mothers, they were women of a certain age. That means they were not sexually attractive anymore. But this means that in Latin American culture, they are not objects of the gaze in the same sense as younger women are. So also being elderly women, they were not perceived as possibly violent demonstrators. They were not perceived as threatening subjects. They were perceived as rather inconspicuous persons. So they were not seen by the police or by the military as capable of actions which would damage, which could damage, possibly damage the state. What they did, because there was an objection to demonstrations and to groupings, they would circle the main pyramid in groups of 2 or 3. So they were obeying the laws against demonstration, which forbid the grouping of more than 3 persons. I think this is a somewhat later stage where they were allowed to have major demonstrations. But this is how the space is organized, with this very phallic symbol in the middle and the women circling it. So they made use of their status as mothers, as women, as being not expected to play a role, to play an important part in public space. They made use of these circumstances, and when they kept on doing this, in the long run, they had the attention of the international press, of the media, of the public at large, and it came to a point where the military could not really do something against them because they were, as mothers, they were people to be respected. So it's because they made use of these conventions that they were able to enact a certain transformative power in that city. Because of their patience, because of the longevity of their actions, because of their silent protest, their motherhood, and so on, they were able to contribute to the finishing off of Argentina's military regime. So Susana Torre stresses in this case study 2 major things. One, that women should also be seen as agents of change. And 2, that there is an inextricable relationship, she calls it, between social action and physical space. Public space is not just made up by architecture or urban design, but it is socially produced. And when in this instance, for example, the women who were there and who were performing these demonstrations really changed the nature of the space and the meaning of that public space. So that's what she calls the social production of public space. Okay, so you see that this opposition between public and private is still operational, I would say, in our days. It's not something that is just of the past. It is still there, probably a little bit less overt, less in the open, but still the accessibility of public space for women and men is not symmetrical. Third chapter is discussing a third appearance of gendered images of the city, the center versus the suburb. This relies upon an analysis by Joan Ockman of post-war, post-World War II, that is American architecture. She says that there are two seminal figures for the American architecture in the first decades after World War II. Lever House by SOM and Levittown. This is Lever House, of course. Levittown is part of the international style, which is, she says, seen as the embodiment of the values of technocracy. This design, this particular aesthetics, is supposed to express the ethos of rationalism, bureaucracy, and techno-scientific progress. For her, this spread is indeed combining the images of international style with an image showing, presumably, the technological progress in making panties. And she also, so the whole idea of technological progress coincides, moreover, according to her, with the emergence of the American military-industrial complex. Former slide belongs to that, and was part of the Cold War rhetoric that the American society was capable of producing at these enormously sophisticated levels of production. What was part of this, according to Ockman, is that there was a clear split between the work world and the domestic world. So the other image is Levittown. You had on the one hand the male culture of production, and on the other hand the female culture of consumption. Levittown, as you know, one of these suburbs, is indeed catching the dream of many, many Americans. Ockman is quoting William Levitt, who was the founder of Levittown, and who describes what home means in the American dream. Home, he says, is a quaint little white cottage, shyly nestled in a grove of old elms or maples, bathed in the perfume of lilacs, and equipped with at least one vine-covered wall. In front of the house, there is invariably a picket fence, with daylilies poking their heads between the white palings. Let into the fence, at the end of a flagstone walk bordered with esselum and verbena, is a swinging gate, where husband and wife embrace tenderly as he dashes for the 8.11 and the workaday world. So this really is the picture of women living with children, staying in the suburbs, men dwelling there but going to downtown each day for their work. And according to Ockman, in fact, both of these images, the Lever House and the Levittown suburban cottage, both are based on a tailorized construction process. So also this is in fact a highly technological product based on a highly rationalized process. But of course its image doesn't say so. It doesn't express these technological qualities. This contradiction didn't bother the buyers in the least, And probably that was where modern architects often were in the wrong, and someone, a developer like Levitt, understood much better what the American public was after. The public, the women especially, were buying a lifestyle, a dream. The myth of the happy housewife was very operative in these decades too. Certainly in America, you had a very short stage, a very short period coinciding with the years of the World War, in which women were supposed to work, were supposed to take the places of the men who went to war. So women have been part of the workforce in these years. Immediately after the end of the war, there was a massive campaign forcing women, or encouraging women to return to the home, to become the happy housewife. And this image of the happy housewife is indeed, has been very, very influential and powerful in the America of the 50s and the 60s. This myth has been criticized, among others, by Betty Friedan, who implied that this myth of the happy housewife had been invented or at least stimulated by American industry, who realized that women would soon become the chief customers of American business. I'm quoting Friedan, "Somehow, somewhere, someone must have figured out that women will buy more things if they are kept in the underused, nameless yearning, energy to get rid of state of being housewives." End of quote. So this was part of the whole capitalist enterprise of, on the one hand, organizing production on a very sophisticated technological and rational basis, and on the other hand, organizing consumption along the same lines, but where the governing images were much more seductive dream images, like, for example, the housewives in the commercial malls, the centers, the commercial centers that were to be developed alongside the suburban cottages. Ockman herself, she states that the postmodern has allowed for changes and has blurred the lines between production and consumption. I would nevertheless hold on to the idea that these associations still are important or working or still are there, maybe not as rigid, not as absolute as they once were, but still I think the association between downtown with its skyscrapers and its rapid pace as the world of male production, the world of men, and on the other hand, the suburbs, the endless rows of homes in suburbs, and as being a place of domesticity and mostly associated with women. I think this kind of associations are still there, although, as I said, not as absolute as they have been. So they have certainly not simply disappeared from our lives, as many women, I think, many ambitious women can witness. Fourth appearance is discussing the city as labyrinth. I refer here mostly to Elizabeth Wilson and her book on the city as labyrinth. She pertains that the classical writings on modernity, like for example those by Walter Benjamin, present the city as the quintessence of modernity and of ambivalence, and that it's especially this feature of ambivalence that also renders them a feminine quality. The city is presented as the quintessence of modernity and ambivalence, the place where extremes of wealth and power and poverty, of enjoyment and misery are both touching one another. So the city is perceived as being a place of intensity and wildness. And this perception, she maintains, is a perception generated by sophisticated urban consciousness, which consciousness is essentially male, because the city is here perceived from the point of view of the male subject, who describes the city in feminine terms. In this literature, there is a conflation between the city and woman's body. Woman is present in these cities, but as temptress, usually as temptress, as whore, as fallen woman, as lesbian. Maybe also as virtuous womanhood in danger, as heroic womanhood who triumphs over temptation and tribulation. But mainly, woman is there as temptress and as whore. So women also in this bunch of literature present a problem, because clearly sexuality in these descriptions of the city, sexuality is seen as a source of threatening ambiguity and disorder in the city. This ambiguity was not only of a sexual nature, it also came about as a result of factors like industrialization, urbanization, and so on, also revolutionary movements crying out for democracy, and so on. So there were lots of factors contributing to the ambiguity of the city, but in this literature it's clear that the city is, in opposition to our first images, that the city is that the city is depicted as having feminine qualities, especially when people describe the urban crowd. When they do this, I'm quoting now Elizabeth Wilson, there were women as well as men in the urban crowd. But the crowd was increasingly invested with female characteristics, while retaining its associations with criminals and minorities. The threatening masses were described in feminine terms as hysterical, or in images of feminine instability and sexuality, as a flute or a swamp. End of quote. So you have this body of literature describing modernity and the city, which renders the city feminine qualities. And that's why Elizabeth Wilson says that at the heart of the urban labyrinth, you do not have the Minotaur, but the female Sphinx, the strangling one, who was so called because she strangled all those who could not answer her riddle. So the city is getting conflated with female sexuality, womanhood out of control, lost nature, loss of identity. Yet, for Wilson, it remains also very, very important that although the city is described as this, as a place of growing threat and paranoia to men, yet the city might also be a place of liberation for women. Maybe the two are partly the same. The city, she says, offers women freedom. Even if women's presence in the city is an uneasy one, chances are there that the city provides better opportunities for women than any other place they might inhabit. The city offers pleasure and deviation and disruption, and all these, and women are dearly in need of these if they want to make a life of their own. So for her, she is quite critical of the anti-urbanist tendencies of the left and of the anti-urbanist tendencies within feminist thought. For her, it's clear that feminism should be pro-city and that it should not restrict itself too narrowly to issues of safety, welfare, or protection, but rather should embrace this ambiguous, ambivalent experience of the city. That feminism should insist on women's right to carnival, to the intensity, to the risks of the city. Urban life, she claims, however fraught with difficulty, has emancipated women more than rural life or suburban domesticity. Now, another instance where the city is being presented as a labyrinth, and where these labyrinthic qualities of the cities are being conflated with the image of woman, is to be found in the films, in cinema, in film noir and neo-film noir especially. Here, these traditions represent the city as a labyrinthine world of darkness, disorder, irrationality, temptation, a world that is not completely known or decipherable. They often bring to the fore the figure of the femme fatale, which can be seen as an allegorical figure for the opaque, mysterious city. I suppose you are familiar with the basic narrative of the film noir. You have a so-called fall guy, sometimes a detective, a private eye, who tries to solve a crime or something by rationally investigating traces. That guy is often being tempted, like here, by a femme fatale who is definitely living in the city, a femme fatale, and sometimes at the opposite side of the spectre there is a country girl which is innocent and sometimes rescues the male hero and who represent the innocence of the countryside. So the city and the femme fatale are the unknown, the unknowable labyrinth, the place of seduction and temptation, of vice and crime, where innocence is threatened and virtue not rewarded. Also in this tradition, the city is being represented as a site of ambiguity, and ambiguity, it seems, is a typically female, feminine characteristics. The city is both a source of anxiety and a source of pleasure. Like the feminine, it captures the double nature of things. This very ambiguity, as I said, Christine Boyer, quoting Christine Boyer, this very ambiguity is indeed what conflates the city and the feminine. Christine Boyer is analyzing the film Chinatown along these lines, where the detective, Jack Nicholson, is seen as the embodiment of rationality, is struggling against the mystery, unraveling all the threads. Faye Dunaway, of course, is the femme fatale who makes it plausible that the truth will never be known in the end. And she is like this mysterious figure who is very much alike the mysterious nature of the city itself. Now, this detective, who in the end still does not know how things really worked out, so he is not the hero who was finally the one who really unraveled all the mysteries, but still he occupies the traditional subject position of the white male who desires to know and to exert control. And this is important to see this parallel, that the subject position of the white male who desires to know and to exert control, that this exactly is the subject positions that architects and planners use to take. Elizabeth Wilson already hints at this, that it would be possible to describe the emergent town planning movement in the 19th century as a kind of organized campaign to really impose the male rationality, male order of things on the city, and in that way to exclude women and children along with other disruptive elements. And she mentions the working class, the poor, minorities, to exclude all these disruptive elements from the infernal urban spaces altogether. That this, in fact, was what planning would be all about. Now, this point of view is shared by Barbara Hooper. I'm arriving at the last chapter of this talk, planning as disciplining the city's body. Barbara Hooper analyzes how planning, in the moment that it was inventing itself as master, as knower, as producer of order, that planning then took on the baggage of the dominant cultural tradition and hence came to function not simply as the emancipatory practice it theorized, but as a participant in new forms of social control directed at women. So for her, it's clear that, or at least that's what she analyzes in this paper, that the tradition of planning, as it emerged from the 19th century onwards, and of course Haussmann is a very important name there, that this planning, in fact, can be conceived of as the disciplining of the city's body. And the city's body in this metaphorical constellation is clearly then seen as a female body. And she unravels all these associations as well in the work of Haussmann as in the work of Le Corbusier. So for Haussmann, his urban surgery, you could say, of Paris comes forth from a desire which is directed against this disorder of the body. The disorder of the urban body, which was Paris, and which was filthy, and which was unhygienic, and which was overfull, and where you could not possibly go from one place to the other. This old Paris was clearly not rational, not logical, and it was in need of interventions. Now, if you analyze this discourse as Barbara Hooper is doing, then you see that the underlying metaphor indeed is that what is perceived as being especially dangerous is the curse and the excesses of the female body. What Haussmann does is imposing a rigid system of boulevards, straight lines, upon the body of Paris, curving through this body, this old body, his new boulevards. This process is being rationalized, is being legitimated because Paris is talked about as in terms of urban pathology, and that is a metaphor that Le Corbusier, of course, will be using also. This urban pathology describes the city as a body that is unhealthy and disordered. And the representation of this disorder is female. What Haussmann is after is an idea of regularization. He conceives of the city in the body language of organs and tissues and arteries and veins and lung and heart and so on. You are familiar with this, I guess. In its diseased state, the city is leprous, cancerous, and so on. The cure is conceived of in terms of the straight line, an order of abstraction and rationalization. So the body of the city is being conquered with statistical and empirical analysis, a detailed planimetric and topographical mapping, followed by the development and imposition of a comprehensive plan. So the body needs surgery. The body of the city needs surgery, and according to Hooper, this whole intervention, this whole strategy, is in fact, or is directed at women, because women are mostly seen as embodying the most dangerous aspects of the city, and then especially, of course, the prostitutes. But throughout this whole discourse and these practices, the city is also produced. The body and the city are both produced as social disorder, as well as representation of disorder as female prostitute body in the end. So I'm quoting Barbara Hooper to end this part on Hausmann. The production of order as the idea of a plan instituted by the authority of male science against the disorder that is concretized and fleshed, made real in the bodies and territories of the objected, excluded other. The filth and dirt of the slums, the colonized territories of Africa and the Orient, the bodies of women, the urban masses, the insane, the sick, the criminal, and most notoriously, the body of the prostituted. So there is a kind of conflation of all these others that have to be rationalized and ordered according to the logic and the authority of male science. Now there are many analyses who indeed make clear that also Le Corbusier's ideas about the city and about urbanism can consistently be understood within this tradition, the tradition started by Hausmann. For Le Corbusier also, he describes Paris as a diseased city, a city in need of surgery, whereby the idea of straightening up is very important. He, as you know, he opposes curved streets. For him, the straight line is the most important thing. Underlying metaphors are also there. In that case, the female body against the male rational mind. Plan voisin, but it's also documented. Zeynep Çelik has done important work in this respect in Le Corbusier's attitude towards Algiers. What you see in the work of Le Corbusier about Algiers, she claims, is that there is a certain association between the Kasbah, which you see presented there, which is presented as a veiled head. So there is an association, and she documents this by other quotes and drawings. There is a clear association between the indigenous city, the Kasbah, and the indigenous female. And this, of course, in that respect, Le Corbusier is absolutely not an exception. There is a whole tradition that is being analyzed and documented elsewhere, where it's clear that within colonial discourse and colonial practices, there was a clear association of indigenous women with colonized land. And this association legitimated the perception of both women and land as objects of colonization. So the desire to conquer and to control colonized territory is also often metaphorically expressed in terms of sexual desire. And as a consequence of parallel to this, cities are often, certainly colonial cities, are often described in female terms. For example, quote from Marius Bernard, Algiers, so seductive and easygoing, a town to be loved for the deep purity of her sky, the radiant splendor of her turquoise sea, her mysterious smells, the warm breath in which she wraps her visitors like a long caress. Or Le Corbusier himself describing Algiers as, quote, a magnificent body, supple-hipped and full-breasted, end of quote. Now, in this case study, Zeynep Çelik makes clear that the case of Algiers is also interesting in another respect, for the gender spaces in Algiers are not only domestic interiors which belong to women, whereas the space of the streets, the public space, belongs to men, but you have a very peculiar space in Algiers, the rooftop terraces, which traditionally belonged to women. So women have a public space of their own on top of the city. And she describes how that you can consistently trace within colonial discourse this desire to capture as well domestic interiors as also these rooftop terraces. So colonizers try to appropriate these spaces. They do that, well, by way of Orientalist paintings, that is well known, but also, she says, modern architects like, for example, Roland Simonet, try to appropriate these rooftop terraces by making new projects which try to make use of these spaces, try to interpret them, reframe them, and in fact do not completely succeed in their attempts. But for her, what she shows is that the underlying logic here is the logic of male desire of control. Well, you probably are also familiar with Beatrice's Colomina analysis of Le Corbusier's attitude towards the city and towards dwelling and architecture, in which Le Corbusier is very often stating that the most important human capacity is the capacity of the gaze, looking, seeing. That is for him the most important thing, and if you can look, then you can dwell. And so for him, and she illustrates this by these series of drawings, for him architecture and planning, but especially architecture, are especially about framing the gaze. Now, that's we probably knew already, but what Colomina is pointing at is that in many instances it also becomes clear that for Le Corbusier, like for this whole tradition, the gaze is also the male gaze. So the subject position is being occupied by males and not by females. So also in this sense you can trace in Le Corbusier's work these ideas or these notions, these gendered images and metaphors, which are really constitutive for the discourse. So let me try to formulate a kind of conclusion, or rather a starting point for the work that I would like to do with some among you in the seminars, and the ideas I will try to develop further in the next lectures. I think what this attempt of gender studies in architecture, what this is all about, is can be clearly caught in the title of a recent edited volume by Leonie Sandrecock, which is called "Making the Invisible Visible." making the invisible visible. The idea is, the intention is to show that the discourses of planning and of architecture, that these are not innocent, that within these discourses and within these practices, that you have all these by now invisible genealogies which are at work, which are operative. And that, for example, the very definition of what planning is and what architecture is, that these very definitions tend to cover up, to wipe out, to erase the contribution of women and the contribution, the positive contributions of the feminine. There is a kind of prevalence given within the definition itself of what planning is and what architecture is, prevalence given to what men do rather than to what women do. So there is this intricate and intimate entanglement of different scales and issues which are at work in many, many respects, and it's these entanglements that gender studies try to unravel. Because the idea is, also for me, that if these metaphors are constitutive for our ways of thinking, and if they are discriminating, which they sometimes are, it is worthwhile to at least detect where they are discriminating, because that might be the first condition to get further and to be able to do something against this discrimination. Thank you for your attention.
Hilde, I was trying to discern what your position was from the positions that you were reporting. And I guess I got a little nervous when, with the sections where there was kind of like a gendering of the object going on, whereby the gaze was gendered, the city was gendered, rationality was gendered, and so on. Because it seemed to me that there was a conflation going on, and the whole question of social praxis was being elided in such a position. And it strikes me that really, if one is to try and take a position on how architecture is gendered, rather than citing Ligure, Cristeda, and Sixu, that the crucial feminist theorist is Judith Butler, and the way in which her discourse about identity based on performativity seems to open up a space for understanding the gendering of architectural space as based on the gendered spatial practices that go on there. Mm-hmm. Now, would you take that as yourself, and therefore would you criticise those who've made that conflation, or what?
I do think there are several scales and issues at stake. So I do not think that these conflations are, as you call them, that they can be taken for granted, or that they are absolute, or that they are always there and most definitely constitutive of whatever discourse and so on. I agree, whenever you go deeper into a specific case study, you always encounter instances where this overall analysis does not hold. Nevertheless, for me, it's not innocent either. So I do think that you have to deconstruct all these constructions, like the construction that aligns rationality with male consciousness. I do think it's important to at least see that. Of course, the consequence cannot be that women cannot be rational or something like that. But deconstructing the tradition where these ideas come from remains for me the very first step to take. As to Judith Butler, I must admit that I am not familiar with her work, so I cannot really comment on that. It remains there for me as on my reading list as an important next step to take. But I think what we need to do, and in that sense I thought this case study by Susanna Torre was very interesting, is to confront the ideology that is there in the discourse and that in a certain way is being petrified in stone on, for example, public space and what it represents, to confront this with indeed the practices that are going on there, and that it's this interaction that is constantly going on and where in fact a kind of negotiation takes place. I think this is really where we have to look. But I would not just do away with the deconstructing of this tradition of binary logic and so on, because it is active in architectural discourse too. So I would not just say, well, let's forget about it, let's go on and discuss different things. I do think it remains important to pay attention to that.
I would like to ask a question about, I understand that there is a need to make the invisible visible, and that there is a need to map history, and that there is a need to write women into history, and that in spatial disciplines this, unlike in mainstream feminist studies, in spatial disciplines there's still a lack of writing women into history. But my question would be, do you have any proposals of where we start to build? Like, do you have any proposals for looking in the future? Like,
Well, I think that's not an easy question, because if you take these first two strands of feminist thinking, thinking in terms of equality or thinking in terms of difference, then it's quite clear what the strategy is in terms of politics. That in the first instance, the strategy is make sure that women have everywhere the same equal opportunities as men have, and that in all professions they will be similarly present, and so on and so on. And the second trend of thought says, well, women should stress their difference, so they should more make spaces for themselves, more talk to one another, and value this matriarchal heritage, and so on. So in both cases, it's more or less clear what the political implications of these lines of thinking are. It's less clear if you participate in this constructionism or this deconstructivist analysis, because indeed the answer is not immediately there. What now? What as a women architect or as a professional, what is the next step and how do you build? I just have the answer of any theorist or intellectual, I guess, saying that I think if you take care to build insights, to understand more about the discourse and about gender practices and so on, then this will, in one way or another, be an input for design projects. But I cannot immediately point and say, well, this is how you have to do it, and look, this would be the way. I find a kind of alignment between the things that I find valuable in studying this kind of analysis, and other ideas I had already before because of this tradition of critical theory. Like, for example, that architecture should indeed address also issues of the everyday, and that architecture should be about, not only about monumental buildings and about high culture and about the star system and about the glossy magazines, but that architecture indeed is about, and that's also why I started with the city today, that architecture is about everyday spaces, and that consistently you see, that's the topic of one of the next lectures, consistently you see that women who were active in architecture were stressing this kind of approaches, and were also consistently being erased from the history of architecture, or at least being erased as important names. So for me, this kind of insights of ideas it remains important to see what happens, to unravel what happens. What next? That I think it's very complicated. I have no straightforward answer to that. I do not know whether you might have one.
Stop there. Hilde, thank you very much.